Boa noite. Começamos agora o segundo painel do primeiro dia da Conférence Pour le Brésil, Caminhos para a adesão do Brasil ao OCDE. A possível adesão do Brasil ao OCDE vem gerando muitos debates entre acadêmicos, políticos e sociedade civil. E essa questão será uma das questões essenciais para os programas de política externa dos candidatos das eleições deste ano. Por isso, nós organizamos esse painel com representantes da OCDE, da sociedade civil e do governo brasileiro para explorarmos essas questões. Gostaríamos novamente de agradecer aos nossos parceiros, BMJ Consultores Associados, Educalibras, CUS e Sanspo, por nos possibilitar criar um evento online gratuito e com tradução simultânea para inglês, português e libras. Agora eu vou passar a palavra para o moderador José Antônio Ardavi, chefe do Departamento da América Latina e do Caribe da Secretaria de Relações Globais da OCDE, para darmos início ao painel. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Boa noite aos estudantes brasileiros. We will talk in English in this panel, unless Ambassador Cozendey wants to use Portuguese, but unfortunately Andreas and myself will speak in English. But thank you very much to Cianspo and to all the organizers of this event, Pour le Brésil. I guess you really have a very interesting day and discussions tomorrow as well. And we hope that we know it's Friday evening, so in a cold Friday evening in April, but we will try to make this panel as much as a conversation of Friday evening that as interesting as we can. As you know, and you might have seen in the news, Brazil was invited in January to become member of the OECD. So this is the main topic of discussion. I assume that as Brazilians, most of you, there might be some questions about what is this about, what are the implications, when this started, and we really have a very interesting panel precisely with some of the key actors that made this happen, and also some of the people that can know about the implications of this process. So first of all, it's very good to welcome Ambassador Carlos Márcio Cozendey. He's the Brazil's delegate to international economic organizations based in Paris, and he obviously has the perspective of the government of Brazil, and not only obviously of this government. He has been representative in many governments and in Brazil, and knows very well the relationship between Brazil and the OECD that has been quite long in the story. Then we also have Andreas Schall. He's the Director of Global Relations at the OECD, and also Sherpa to the G20 and G7 and other bodies in which the OECD engages. And in this position, he has also been keen in the process of approaching Brazil, first as a OECD, in the OECD and the G20, and also as a key partner, and right now as an accession country. So he will probably talk more about precisely how we reached to this point and what is coming in the next stages. And then it's very good to have with us also Júlia Mello Neiva. Hello, Júlia. She is from Conectas, human rights, and this is one of the civil society associations that have been following very closely the cooperation of Brazil and the OECD. It's one of the institutions that participates often in the debates on responsible business conduct and other debates in the OECD. So, well, obviously, we just heard in the panel before the private sector. I guess this is a process, obviously, that engages government, the OECD, but also society at large and the private sector. So with that very brief introduction, probably just to follow more or less the structure, it might be good to hear first from Andreas a little bit on all the history behind this invitation to the accession process. What is it for Brazil to gain in becoming a member of the OECD one day? And then probably on the Brazilian side, Ambassador, you can also tell us a little bit of why Brazil has been asking for accession to the OECD, what Brazil sees as what are the main objectives and how Brazil can benefit from this. And then Júlia can also tell us from the civil society perspective what is the views, and obviously then we will go open for the floor for discussion. So Andreas, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thanks so much, José Antonio. Let me first thank the organizers from Sciences Po for bringing us together in this caipirinha weather, I would say, to discuss Brazil. Pleasure for me to be with you. Second remark because José Antonio said that this will be a very interesting panel. He had to say so because I'm his director, and so we will try to make this really an interesting panel. I'm also glad to be with Ambassador Carlos Cozendey, whom I know since probably 15 years or so. So we have been walked quite some way together in supporting Brazil to get closer to the OECD. The OECD accession process, and this is my third pre-remark, is a catalyst of reform. It's a driver of change for a country. It aligns a country with the world-class standards in many fields, with taxation, anti-corruption, environment. And it's also beneficial for the country in question to have better ratings, to attract more investors. So there are many things which I will go into detail in my presentation. But maybe you allow me to say one word what the OECD is about. The acronym, I mean, we are the masterminds of acronyms at the OECD, so everything which you can cut in 3 letters, we do. So that's why we are so successful in tax, for example, TAX, which is one of our major deliverables. The OECD stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a follow-up organization of the Marshall Plan, which was founded in 1960 when the Marshall Plan money was distributed over Europe and kind of concluded the reconstruction and rebuilding of Europe. And then in December 1960, the then members of the OEC decided to have an organization which is dedicated to develop what we call today better policies for better lives. So an idea where countries, member states learn from each other what policies in economic policies, fiscal policy, labor market policy, pension policy, education policy work in other countries and how they can learn from each other. We have been, I mean, this was, of course, because of the Marshall Plan at the beginning, a bit of a Eurocentric organization, but the US is a founding member. Japan joined just right, like 4 years later in 1964. Then Australia, New Zealand, Korea, other countries become member. Mexico, as the first Latin American country, joined in 1994. And more recently, because we had 15 years the Mexican Secretary General, but not only because of that, but the OECD has been moving much closer to Latin America, but also Latin America, and Carlos stands for, has been moving closer to the OECD. So this has led to Chile joining the OECD in 2010, Colombia in 2020, Costa Rica in 2021. So just today we are out of a meeting with the outgoing president Carlos Alvarado, who kind of highlighted how much the accession process of Costa Rica has changed Costa Rica, the country itself, how much they used it to reform the independence of the central bank, a fiscal reform, which was kind of putting the country in line with a value-added tax, which was not there before, in line with best standards, and which was only possible because there was the political will, there was the OECD accession process, and there was a readiness of also the parliament to support this kind of reforms. So he was, I have to say, very, very excited today about the accession process of Costa Rica to the OECD, and we hope in a couple of years we will have the president of Brazil equally excited about the accession process in Paris. In the past, very often the OECD has been described as a rich man's club, which we always reject, and we always have discussion with the economists. So now they refer to us as a mostly rich man's club or mostly industrialized club, but we believe that what the former president Bachelet of Chile said, that the OECD is a club of best practices, because we are kind of developing these policies which work in countries, and we advise countries on that, describes the OECD better. We're also developing OECD standards. There are more than 250 OECD standards which count in OECD countries, but which count also beyond OECD's membership. For example, in the field of taxation, we have developed a standard for BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, which makes that companies like Google or Facebook pay taxes somewhere. And this is a standard which was first developed by 38 members. Then we brought it to the G20. And then from the G20, in the meantime, we have now 141 countries who are adhering to this standard and who develop this standard further together. So the OECD is really trying to be a pathfinder for globalization. And one of the reasons why, for example, I myself, I'm very motivated, and this goes back to my student time, to work at the OECD, is because I really sincerely believe that we need an organization who is shaping globalization, who is defining the rules of the game, who is helping to provide a level playing field. This brings me now to the topic what we have today, and that's why also we are so excited to have Brazil now on a path to accession. It's not yet that the OECD has invited Brazil to become a member, but the OECD has invited Brazil to start the accession process, which is normally a process of 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the magnitude. But Brazil has done already a lot of his homework, because Brazil has asked for membership in 2017 after we had worked with Itamaraty, with Carlos Cozendey on a joint work program where Brazil has fulfilled in less than 2 years 95% of all the agreed actions and more than 120 actions. This means that today, out of 251 instruments, Brazil is already adhering to 100. So 104, no, 5 even. It says 5 in my notes. 5.
The ones that accumulate in the weekend.
Yeah. 6 next month. And so there is already a lot of homework Brazil has done. This includes policy areas like environment, education, regulatory policy, competition, investment, taxation, trade, transparency, public service, public governance, quite a lot. We have this decision now from January from our council to open accession discussion with Brazil, as well as with Argentina, Peru, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia. And all these countries are currently now under consideration. We develop a roadmap, and then we will have initial discussions how to implement these roadmaps with Brazil. And Brazil will then define its position in an initial memorandum to the remaining OECD standards. I should say that OECD accession is not a simple formality. It's really a thorough process. There will be examinations in more than 25 committees in the OECD, so that's why it's a multi-annual process, where each candidate country is discussing its policies to see whether they are aligned with OECD best practices. And there is no deadline for the completion, so this is a process which will then conclude when all the boxes are ticked. And Ambassador Cozendey did a very valuable exercise before applying to look into ways where Brazil's policy already comply with OECD standards, where there is a way to go, where it's easy to go. I will explain you better later, so I'm not sitting there. We believe that there is a lot of benefits for Brazil. There's a lot of benefits for the OECD to have Brazil in, because as I said, we are shaping global standards in the country, key leader, the 8th largest economy in the world, like Brazil, really has to have a seat at the table when these standards, which count on a global scale, are developed. We believe there is also a lot of positive insights for Brazil. For example, Brazil has just adhered to the OECD Codes for Liberalization of Capital Movement, which is an instrument to help countries to reap the benefits of capital flows while mitigating the risks associated with their volatility. This does not mean that you cannot have capital controls or other macroprudential measures, but this means that you just need to be transparent about it and discuss with other countries in order to avoid the volatility of or too much volatility in capital markets. So adherence to this instrument is a big step and required also quite some reform and adjustment. And we're very glad that this is normally a process countries do only within an accession process. I should also say that an accession process is usually not only a government process, I mean the negotiations of course with the government, but it's a whole of society process. So we usually are heavily involved with the parliaments. For example, as I referred to Costa Rica, the fiscal reform was only possible because before there were several countries fighting against the fiscal reform. It was only possible because there was a consensus then in the parliament to go ahead. So this is something which is really important to have the political buy-in, but also the buy-in of stakeholders of societies into the accession process. I should say bringing Brazil into the OECD. I mean, we're working we actually know each other from the G20. We're working together with Brazil over the years in the G20 context, but the OECD is also more and more helping and supporting G20, APEC, ASEAN, Pacific Alliance, other fora of regional governments with defining standards which then can be leveraged with the respective fora. I refer to taxation, for example, where we have now in automatic exchange of tax information 160 countries, in BEPS 140 countries. And for example, in 2020, this resulted in exchange of information on 75 million financial accounts, covering total assets of nearly 9 trillion. And with this exercise, countries could get additional tax revenues of 112 billion euros, which is quite significant as an instrument, which is just a standard. Another area where we kind of believe that the OECD is a pathfinder is the standards on responsible business conduct, which are in our OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. This is a system where you can, in the guidelines for multinational enterprises, you ensure universal values like human rights, environmental standards, the protection of social partners, of trade unions. So this is another instrument. So how we want to make sure that multinational enterprises play the same rules. And there's in each country, it's a so-called national contact point, which then a trade union, a civil society organization can be called on if they think that a company has not observed these international guidelines. And we have more than in 2020, these national contact points worldwide have handled more than 575 cases. So this is something which is also an important instrument. Should say what is again beneficial for Brazil? Brazil has a long-standing history in active engagement with the OECD. It's already adherent to more than 1/3 of our instruments. There are a number of reforms which are still ongoing. For example, we're in a big project with Receita Federal, the tax authority, where we kind of try to align Brazil's tax policy with international standards on transfer pricing, removing the risks of double taxation, raising additional tax revenues. This is also something where I see Brazil very committed to move and to reform. Another important area, and this is probably something which will be with us for quite some time, and we just had our environmental policy ministers meeting, and Brazil adhered today to the environmental policy ministerial declaration, is of course environmental protection, protection of the Amazon, climate change. This is something where also the accession process to the OECD will foresee a number of conversations and a number of alignments of Brazil's policy with OECD instruments. So with that, I think maybe as a start, I would leave it there. So just to leave with you the thought that the OECD is very honored and proud to have Brazil as a country who wants to join, and we really want to make the most out of it. And we are also very happy to have conversations with you, with interested people, to see what if there are issues we are missing, or if there are issues we better take a hard look. So very happy to be here today and to enjoy this conversation.
Thank you, Andreas. Now we give the floor to Ambassador Cozendey. Ambassador, from the Brazil perspective, what is that brought Brazil to adhere to the OECD? Brazil used to, well, it's a very important country, largest in Latin America, and it's a leader of development countries as well. So in that context, how and why joining the OECD, and how this process was made?
Obrigado. Um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. Eu achei que poderia ser interessante pegar o documento que foi distribuído, a nota conceitual do painel, e fazer um comentário de alguns elementos que foram colocados aqui na nota, porque são elementos muito comumente levantados ou divulgados sobre a OCDE, e vamos checar, então, se eu acho que eles são verdadeiros ou não. Né? É fake news ou é isso mesmo. Né? Então, assim, logo no primeiro parágrafo, vem algo que a gente ouve muito, que é a OCDE é o clube dos países ricos. Bom, o André já mencionou que o México, a Colômbia, a Costa Rica são todos membros da OCDE, então já tem aí alguma coisa estranha. Mas por que se fala isso? Porque originalmente era o Clube dos Países Ricos. Né? Nos anos 70, a OCDE não só pelos seus membros, eram os países desenvolvidos daquele momento, mas também na dinâmica política daquele momento, da política internacional, era aonde se coordenavam as posições, digamos, do norte, né, enquanto o Sul coordenava suas posições na UNCTAD, apoiando-se na Secretaria da UNCTAD, e aí, então, se fazia o diálogo norte-sul um pouco entre esses dois blocos. Né? Mas depois da queda do Muro de Berlim, com a aproximação dos países do leste europeu, né, que começaram a querer, então, entrar na OCDE, e aí isso foi equilibrado pela entrada do México e da Coreia, a organização começou a se transformar, né? Ela deixou de ter esse propósito principal e se tornou cada vez mais o que está aqui no próprio parágrafo logo em seguida. É uma organização para a cooperação e discussão de políticas públicas e econômicas que visam auxiliar no desenvolvimento de seus países membros. Então, a OCDE se transformou, na verdade, um clube de discussão de políticas públicas, de tentar encontrar quais são as melhores práticas e tentar difundir essas melhores práticas. Eu acho que você pode dizer que a OCDE tem, o André falou do negócio da 104, 105, é o seguinte, você tem 252, hoje, tem 252 recomendações e decisões, né? São instrumentos jurídicos nas mais diversas áreas, a OCDE tem um escopo vastíssimo, cobre praticamente todas as políticas públicas, exceto defesa. Mesmo assim, defesa, né, se você for falar em indústria de armamento, já vai aparecer alguma coisa lá dentro. Então, são 252 instrumentos que cobrem um campo muito grande. 40% disso são questões de meio ambiente e produtos químicos, né? Então, isso já dá uma ideia também do papel que essa área tem dentro da organização. E isso é resultado de conversas entre os países, entre os especialistas, entre os ministérios que cuidam dessas políticas em diferentes países, se juntam lá em país, conversam sobre os assuntos, identificam que tem um problema que onde há interesse comum, o secretariado estuda aquele assunto, traz dados, cria banco de dados, compara as políticas dos países, e quando eles acham que há uma convergência, que todo mundo está indo naquela direção e que aquelas são as melhores maneiras de fazer, isso se transforma, então, numa recomendação. Esses instrumentos têm dois tipos, eu diria assim, dois grandes tipos, né? Um é esse de ser melhores práticas, né? Então, você recomenda que os países adotem aquilo ali, é o interesse do próprio país fazer aquilo, porque aquilo viu-se que é bom, né? Isso pode ser desde um nível bem elevado de abstração, grandes princípios, até um nível quase de um regulamento técnico, como acontece muitas vezes, por exemplo, na área de produtos químicos. Você tem um outro tipo de instrumento que é de padrões mínimos de comportamento. Então, se tem alguma área que na arena internacional é melhor você ter uma regra comum para evitar disputas, para evitar discussões, para evitar competição desleal, então você cria uma regra para tentar que todo mundo se comporte de maneira parecida. Por exemplo, a OCDE tem um acordo sobre financiamento oficial de exportações, é quando um governo financia uma exportação de uma empresa para outro país, né? Se você deixar isso sem regra, cada país vai tentar oferecer o juro mais baixo, o prazo maior, o financiamento mais vantajoso, e aí as empresas não vão mais competir com seus produtos, os seus preços, vão competir com seus financiamentos, na verdade, com seus tesouros. E o país que tiver o tesouro mais rico vai ganhar a competição nas exportações. Para evitar isso, você faz um acordo dizendo, não, todo mundo tem que cobrar pelo menos essa taxa de juros, tem que cobrar, pode dar no máximo esse prazo, tem que ter essas condições dos empréstimos, de forma que as empresas compitam pela sua produtividade, pelos seus preços, e não pelo seu financiamento baseado no tesouro, né? Então, você estabelece um padrão mínimo de comportamento. Isso na OCDE não é sequer, é um arranjo, não é sequer uma recomendação obrigatória, mas todo mundo segue, porque se alguém não seguir, os outros também não vão seguir, é ruim para todo mundo, né? Então, você tem, em grandes linhas, esses dois tipos de instrumentos na organização, como resultado de ser uma organização que busca ajudar os países a desenvolver melhores políticas. Aí segue o documento. Os membros recebem um selo que pode ajudar na atração de investimentos. Isso é muito falado, é muito comum, eu não gosto dessa analogia, me implico um pouco com ela, porque ela dá a impressão de que vai vir um certificador que vai examinar e vai dizer assim, não, faz isso, faz isso, tá, ok, tá bom, e aí na hora que falar, ok, todo mundo vai correr e vai fazer um monte de investimento, e é muito difícil você ter a literatura, você tem estudos tentando identificar se quando o país entra na OCDE, ele recebe muito mais investimento, mas é muito difícil, porque geralmente quando o país faz isso, como vocês estão vendo, ele vai mudar várias políticas, ele está num contexto de realizar reformas, então é difícil você isolar o fator OCDE de outras causas, algumas das quais resultam do próprio processo de acessão ao OCDE, né? Então, assim, é importante, os países olham, tem realmente alguns fundos de investimento que só investem em países que são da OCDE, então, claro, não é que não tem nenhum impacto nesse sentido, mas eu acho que é muito mais importante o fato de que o processo de acessão é um grande processo de revisão e melhoria das suas políticas públicas do que o objetivo simplesmente de, no final, quando eu terminar tudo, vou ter mais investimento. Pois o documento menciona, que isso foi muito publicado, né, que em 2019 o Brasil renunciou ao tratamento diferenciado na Organização Mundial do Comércio. Deixa eu explicar rapidamente o que é isso, depois, se vocês quiserem, a gente pode aprofundar, mas, basicamente, o que acontece? Tradicionalmente, na OMC, os acordos têm cláusulas que favorecem países em desenvolvimento, dando mais vantagens ou menos obrigações. Não necessariamente ter menos obrigações é mais vantagem, né? Às vezes seria bom ter aquela obrigação, porque você estaria, seria um sinal de que a sua economia está melhor, de que seu desenvolvimento está maior, mas, digamos assim, em princípio, os acordos da OMC muitas vezes são negociados com cláusulas de tratamento diferenciado. Muitas vezes essas cláusulas de tratamento diferenciado não valem muito, porque assim, vamos procurar ajudar, vamos tentar fazer, são cláusulas de melhores esforços, acabam não tendo tanto impacto, mas às vezes tem algum impacto muito direto. Por exemplo, no acordo de salvaguarda, se um país desenvolvido aplicar uma salvaguarda, portanto, dificultar a entrada de produtos de outros países, e o país em desenvolvimento tiver menos de X% das importações daquele país, esse país em desenvolvimento não vai ser atingido por essa salvaguarda, vai poder continuar exportando. Isso é um caso bem concreto, não é, como falei, não é tão comum nos acordos, mas tem esse tipo de cláusula. Quando o Brasil renunciou ao tratamento diferenciado, ele não renunciou a nada do que está nos acordos que já existem. O que o Brasil falou foi, daqui para frente, nos acordos que vão ser negociados, eu topo negociar de igual para igual. Eu topo não pedir um tratamento geral diferenciado. Que perda isso implica para o Brasil? Nenhuma, porque hoje na negociação ninguém vai aceitar que o Brasil tenha um tratamento diferenciado desse tamanho, nem a China, nem a Índia, nenhum dos grandes países emergentes. Por outro lado, quando você vai para a negociação caso a caso, todo mundo tem um tratamento diferenciado. Se você for no texto que acabou não sendo aprovado, mas que foi negociado na rodada Doha, né, de agricultura, você vai ver lá um parágrafo que não está escrito Suíça, mas descreve uma prática que existe na Suíça dizendo que ela pode manter. Não está escrito Canadá, mas descreve uma prática que existe no Canadá dizendo que ele pode manter. Então, na negociação, o tratamento diferenciado acontece e é a própria lógica da negociação. O que não vai acontecer é uma coisa assim que chama blanket, né, para tudo de uma vez. E isso não adianta porque foi uma das razões pelas quais a rodada Doha não foi completada, porque a China, outros países insistiam que tinha que haver um tratamento diferenciado. O Brasil só conseguiu que na reunião ministerial de Nairobi os subsídios à agricultura, subsídios à exportação em agricultura fossem proibidos, porque o Brasil disse, não, em agricultura eu não preciso de tratamento diferenciado, eu sou um dos competidores mais eficientes que tem. Então, o que eu quero é que vocês não tenham tratamento diferenciado, porque na prática, em agricultura, os países desenvolvidos é que têm tratamento diferenciado, porque podem aplicar níveis elevados de subsídios com as regras atualmente existentes. Então, assim, é mais complexo do que parece. Perdeu, renunciou, abriu mão do tratamento. Não é simples assim. Depois diz, a questão do debate sobre a adesão, adesão à sessão. Normalmente em português, em inglês não tem muita diferença, você usa sempre accession, mas em português normalmente você usa adesão quando é uma fórmula já pronta, né, que você simplesmente adota. No caso da OCDE, há uma negociação, né? Então, por isso a gente usa mais o acessão, porque existe todo um exercício de negociação que é efetivado. E aí diz, isso se tornou uma questão controversa e central na agenda de política externa brasileira. Eu diria que na política externa brasileira esse é um dos temas menos controversos hoje. Não estou dizendo que tem consenso, que todo mundo acha e concorda que o Brasil deveria entrar na OCDE, há pessoas e grupos que entendem que não seria benéfico, e é uma discussão válida e necessária, mas, em linhas gerais, é um dos temas menos controversos da política externa hoje, e por isso eu acredito que, independente do resultado das eleições, esse processo de acessão provavelmente continuará. Mas, continuando, né, ele diz o seguinte, mais para frente. A entrada do Brasil nos países ricos faria com que o país regredisse na construção de sua posição de liderança representante dos países sul-sul e países em desenvolvimento. Bom, nós já vimos que a OCDE, né, tem vários países em desenvolvimento no seu corpo de membros. É verdade que quando o México aderiu, né, na década de 80, na década de 90, à OCDE, foi pedido ao México, uma das condições foi que o México saísse do grupo de 77, que nas Nações Unidas é o grupo que reúne os países em desenvolvimento, mas quando o Chile entrou em 2010, isso já não foi exigido. Quando a Colômbia entrou, quando a Costa Rica entrou, isso já não foi exigido, porque já era uma organização que não era mais aquele clube que fazia a posição do norte para para negociar com o Sul. Então, a perspectiva era, quando a presidente Bachelet, né, fez o discurso lá de entrada do Chile na organização, ela falou, não, estou muito contente de estar aqui na casa das boas práticas. Né? Então, um pouco, mudando um pouco a visão do que poderia ser a OCDE. Assim, dizer, não tem nenhum impacto político? Tem. Né? Você vai estar ali compartilhando visões com países que têm o que eles chamam de shared values, né? Assim, o requisito da like-mindedness, né? Então, assim, democracia, a economia de mercado, a abertura comercial, isso são valores básicos aí da OCDE. Aí, efetivamente, se você não quiser se alinhar ou respeitar esses valores, você tem que sair do clube. Então, eu diria o seguinte, se eu entro na OCDE, eu estarei reforçando as minhas características democráticas, porque se eu tentar desviar, os outros países do clube vão falar, o que você está fazendo aí? Que história é essa? Como é que é? Né? Então, se eu achar que eu não devo ser uma economia de mercado, aí realmente eu não devo entrar na OCDE. Mas se eu achar que é interessante ser uma economia de mercado, mas que seja inclusiva, que tenha aspectos sociais contemplados, que é o, digamos, que é a discussão na OCDE hoje, então faz sentido eu entrar na OCDE. Mas, também haveria um custo adicional ao orçamento do país. Aí eu vou dizer para vocês, eu concordo, a OCDE é uma organização cara, mas não é desproporcional em relação ao que são outras organizações internacionais. E certamente não é por pagar a OCDE que a gente vai gerar corte de gastos em áreas como saúde e educação, que é o que o texto menciona aqui. Né? Isso é bem, fica bem claro, não tem nenhuma, a ordem de grandeza é completamente diferente. E o que a OCDE tem ali como obrigação em termos de orçamento? É você ter um orçamento transparente, é você fazer um bom planejamento. Esse é o tipo de discussão que tem na OCDE sobre orçamento. Não é quanto você vai gastar de educação e tem que cortar a educação e tem que ter austeridade. Essa discussão não existe na OCDE. Existirá a discussão macroeconômica de, bom, nesse momento, o que é melhor? E o que a gente viu a OCDE fazendo praticamente nos últimos 20 anos, é dizer para os países não fazer austeridade muito cedo, a situação econômica internacional está complicada, a gente tem que apoiar. Logo depois quando teve a crise do Covid, dizer, olha, essa crise com todo mundo em confinamento vai despencar o crescimento, então os estados têm que entrar, têm que apoiar. Então, assim, a discussão é em função do que está acontecendo, mas seguramente não há uma menor possibilidade da OCDE dizer, não, você tem que cortar recursos de saúde ou de educação. Ao contrário, o que a gente mais vê nos reviews da OCDE, até brinco, né? Toda a área da OCDE que faz um review sempre bota assim, não, tem que botar mais recursos nessa área. Se a gente for seguir tudo que dizem todos os reviews, o orçamento estoura, porque todos eles faz um review de educação, precisa de mais recursos para educação, faz um review de governance, não precisa mais dinheiro aqui para governance. Então, não é esse risco. Esse risco eu tenho certeza que a gente não correrá no processo de exceção. Depois há uma preocupação aqui em que algumas organizações teriam enviado cartas, é fato, indicando que o governo brasileiro teria legislação ou política, dependendo da carta, que contraria direitos humanos, que não respeita o meio ambiente, etc. E tal. Isso é algo que os membros terão que examinar mesmo. Se o Brasil for isso que está sendo dito, o Brasil não vai entrar na OCDE. Né? Então, o processo de acessão na OCDE, outra vez, assim como eu mencionei na questão de democracia, é ao contrário, é um exercício que vai reforçar essas áreas no processo de acessão. Se realmente tudo que essas organizações disseram se aplica ao Brasil hoje, se o Brasil não respeita direitos humanos, não vai conseguir entrar. Né? Então, aí, com mais razão, essas organizações deveriam apoiar o processo de acessão, porque o processo de acessão vai obrigar o governo brasileiro, então, a ter um diálogo com os membros para satisfazer esses critérios mínimos e esses valores compartilhados da organização. Para vocês terem uma ideia, a Colômbia tinha completado quase todo o seu processo. A última grande questão que a Colômbia teve que dar satisfação no processo de acessão foi o fato de que havia um número excessivo de assassinatos de líderes sindicais. Né? Então, a Colômbia teve que, ao longo do processo, no final do processo, mostrar que estava se empenhando para melhorar esse problema, mostrar que os números estavam melhorando. Portanto, o processo foi benéfico para essa dimensão, E hoje não é uma coisa que um governo, obviamente, né, não é uma coisa que você muda a legislação e resolve, né? Quer dizer, obviamente não é permitido matar líderes sindicalistas, mas é uma coisa que exige uma atuação sistemática do governo para combater esse problema. Tenho certeza que no caso do processo de acessão no Brasil, vários temas desses vão surgir. É óbvio que os números de desmatamento terão que ser reduzidos ao longo do tempo para que o Brasil possa entrar na organização. Então, eu concluiria dizendo que das perguntas que foram propostas aqui, acho que a principal é essa aqui: quais políticas públicas brasileiras devem ser desenvolvidas nos próximos anos, dentro do quadro de medidas previstas para a OCDE, para que a adesão do Brasil seja viável e benéfica. Acho que é disso, essa pergunta resume muito bem qual é o conteúdo do processo de acessão e por que eu acredito que, ao ser um grande exercício de revisão das políticas públicas, ele será benéfico para o Brasil. Muito obrigado.
Embaixador. Can you hear me? Okay. Now, very good, and as you can see, the years of cooperation between Brazil and the OECD lead to Andreas explaining what reforms Brazil has been doing in the last few years, and Ambassador Cozendey explaining what are the OECD instruments and how many they are and how is the process. So these are a part of the fruit. But as I was saying, and the ambassador himself said, this is a process where obviously all this interest from society is important, and the accession process to the OECD will also help. And from this perspective, it's good to hear the perspective from civil society. Obviously, there are many voices from civil society, many voices from the private sector, all of which are very important to during the democracy process in every country. So let's hear from Júlia from a civil society perspective. How do you perceive this process that is just starting?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So good afternoon for those in Brazil. Good evening for those in France. It's an honor to be here to participate in this extremely important high-level panel at Pour le Brésil. Thank you very much for the invitation, Sciences Po and organizers. And thank you for this panel. I really like the points that you both addressed before me. So I'm here. I will take this opportunity to address a few issues before the OECD Ministerial Council that shall discuss the principles and roadmaps that will guide our accession. So I will point some issues that civil society, both in Brazil and globally, including OECD Watch, Conectas, the International Federation for Human Rights, the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, several indigenous, labor, and environmental organizations have pointed out. We have just launched a research, and many of these organizations globally have participated in our seminars. So regarding the invitation to become a full member of the OECD, our main message from civil society is that the organization should take into account an analysis of the risks, but also benefits of Brazil joining the organization regarding environmental and human rights issues and also the rule of law. The OECD should also ensure that the accession process for Brazil and other countries is transparent and allows for civil society participation, especially in candidate states. We don't think, unfortunately, at this current moment, that Brazil is actually aligned to OECD practices, policies, and standards, and nor it's meeting its international human rights obligations. So at this right moment, we think it's unfit for accession. I'll explain a bit better the extremely delicate context in which Brazil is now. And thank you for the space to speak today. In recent years, the Brazilian government has unfortunately engaged in numerous attempts to undermine the legal and institutional frameworks essential for the protection of human rights and environmental protection, with dire effects for people, forests, and also for a good responsible business conduct in the country. In a 2021 report conducting an environmental review of Brazil, the OECD itself noted that since 2015, deforestation rates have grown in Brazil to decade-high peaks in 2019 and 2020. Greenhouse gas emissions increased 9.6% in Brazil in 2019. The OECD has also found that deforestation rates inside protected areas have risen by more than 40% in the period 2019-2020 compared to 2018-2019, and that forest fires have increased in the Amazon, as well as in other biomes such as Pantanal and Cerrado. Around 90% of the deforestation in the last 2 years were considered illegal. Now back to our research. We have shown that workers' rights have undergone serious attacks in the past half-decade in Brazil, first through a major reform in 2017 by the previous administration, and continue now under President Bolsonaro's philosophy that fewer rights are better than no jobs. A recent rise in informality of work, leading to more precarious work conditions, coupled with a weakening of unions and poor labor protections, has also led to a range of workers' rights abuses without corresponding to economic growth or decline in unemployment. Environmental human rights defenders in Brazil are also under serious threat. According to data gathered by Global Witness, Brazil has remained the deadliest or one of the top 4 deadliest countries in the world for land and environmental defenders, but this has been for years, not only now. There have been also the dismantling of policies and structures in Brazil, budget and resources cut at key ministries, restructuring and political weakening of key ministries, impunity for bad actors by the executive branch, impunity for bad actors by the judiciary, dismantling of human rights and environmental regulatory and legal framework, repression of and attacks against civil society and the media, and low public access to information and exclusion of civil society from governments. On top of that, unfortunately, the current Brazilian administration has had a poor track record in addressing some of the world's most pressing crises, be it climate change or the global pandemic, show its lack commitment to protect the environment, to protect human rights and the rule of law. We even had to take this to the Supreme Court a case denouncing the government lack of implementation of the policy to prevent and monitor deforestation. You probably saw the hearing yesterday and before yesterday. In a country where there is structural racism and extreme inegalities, such as Brazil, the irresponsibility of the government in dealing with such pressing issues and this mentioned lack of commitment impacts the most vulnerable even more. We're talking here about indigenous people, as you heard Chai say in the previous panel, rural communities, Afro-Brazilian communities, human rights defenders, poor migrant workers, women and children. Unfortunately, we believe the government has often demonstrated complacency or even complicity in allowing social and environmental governments to deteriorate in Brazil. We have to bear in mind that we are in the last decade left to meaningfully change the course of climate change, and Brazil has a playing role in that. So we ask the OECD to truly take into account its analysis of Brazil's candidacy, this accession process, and consider environmental and human rights issues and the rule of law as priorities. We would like to also to ask the OECD not to treat Brazil's accession as it has treated some of other countries in the past, and in which it focused too much on removing barriers to foreign trade and investment. We really believe that human rights and environmental issues and the rule of law should be priorities. These are my initial thoughts. I can speak further if you wish to. I'm happy to answer also some questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Julia, for this perspective. I guess, well, with these first introductions, we can probably open the floor also to have some questions and then give our panelists the opportunity to answer these questions and to comment on the issues. Are there any questions also online if you want to change.
Tem perguntas em linha ou...
We have two microphones over there. If there are any questions you may want to ask. Yes, there's one brave man over there.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Boa noite, yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel.
Por
I
painel
work
muito
for the
interessante.
French Development Agency, and from what we gather within Brazil's accession process, you're not planning on joining the Development Aid Committee. I'd be interested on your thoughts and sort of the rationale behind
de
that.
ajuda a desenvolvimento. Gostaria de ter a sua perspectiva.
Any other question, or we
Outra
can...
pergunta? Ou podemos, o painel pode
Yes,
responder?
Yes, so the developing economies that got into the OECD do not participate in the committee. So for everybody to understand, the OECD works with a number of intergovernmental committees, and there's one committee which is the Committee on Development Aid, where developed countries coordinate their action in international development aid. And so Mexico, Chile, Costa Rica, they are not members of that committee. Of course, to be a member of that committee, you need to have a policy and resources that are used regularly according to certain criteria to help developing countries. And Mexico, Brazil, we have international cooperation with other developing countries, more on a South-South basis. So we have been cooperating a lot with the Development Aid Committee. We have been participating actively in the discussion of some indicators like the TOSD indicator. We are part of the task force and we have been contributing to that discussion as well. And we certainly have an open dialogue with the committee in terms of improving our practices and bringing in our experience. We have this Latin American dialogue, DACLAC, we call that, between the committee and the Latin American program, that from time to time put together cooperation agencies from both regions in order to exchange experiences. So we are quite open to exchange experience, but the decision whether to be part of the committee depends also on the characteristics of the Brazilian cooperation vis-a-vis the characteristics of the cooperation of the countries who are there. So at this point, if I look to the committee and I look to the other similar countries that are in the OECD, they are not part. So I would think it's not, we still don't have a position on that, but I would think that it would be a similar position to what we have for Mexico or Colombia, but we'll have to see that along the way.
Yeah, maybe just to complement what Ambassador Cozendey just said. I mean, the issue is there is the question of formal membership in the Development Assistance Committee, but there are 50 ways to Rome. So, I mean, there is the LACDAC dialogue. There is a lot of work going on blended finance in the G20, where we work closely together with Brazil. There's a lot of work going on the TOSD, on the total official development aid. So there are many avenues where we work together already on development cooperation without having the formal membership in the committee. And the DAC is one of those committees who is not part of the formal accession process to the OECD, precisely for the reasons that just mentioned.
We have another question over here.
Yes, good evening. So much was said about the private sector procedure and also how it could stimulate and help the process of accession of Brazil to the OECD, as well as NGOs and the public sector. But I would like to ask, what is the best way for the private sector to follow the process and discussions related to the accession process, and which instruments should Brazil find it more difficult to follow for this to achieve the completion of this process, I would say like tax or maybe sustainability. Let me hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if Andreas, you want to take the first part on the private sector and how to engage in the process, and Ambassador on the second part.
I think this is maybe also to answer the point raised on civil society engagement. At this very moment, the ball is in the camp of our members. We are defining so-called roadmaps, which precisely defines which committee will discuss which country, what will be the major political issues. So I want to also respond a bit to say, I mean, we are at the moment, you know, in a photographic moment where you do not photograph the finish of the race, but you photograph the beginning of the race in the OECD accession process. And then, of course, it depends which camera you use, whether you use the camera of the civil society, the camera of the business sector. At this very moment, I said the ball is more in our membership. This will change, and I think there will be plenty of opportunities for the business sector and also for civil societies to give their input in the process. So I'm not too worried also about many of the things mentioned here, because many of the things mentioned will be part of the accession process and will be discussed during accession. And the beauty of the OECD accession process is really a transformational process, meaning that it supports countries to change policies, to adopt policies. I mean, not sure whether we land everywhere where the civil society wants us to be, but this is certainly something which is part of our philosophy, which is our leitmotif. Our motto is better policies for better lives. So take into account the life of the people. And this also includes an ongoing dialogue with the business sector. We have excellent relationships with companies in Brazil, with the Confederation of CNI, the Confederation of Brazilian Industry, and the Brazilian industry even supported some of the reform projects we already have advanced, like the transfer pricing project, like the taxation project. So there's a vivid exchange already. And I can only encourage you to be part. At this very moment, I have to say, we do not do too many public interactions because it's in the ball more in the camp of our members. So what we do today exclusively for you is actually an exception to the rule. But we will certainly be back in the second half of the year with more also, let's say the process will be technical, but there will be accompanying also public events with industry, with civil societies, and with civil society organizations, and we will try to be this, have this also an open dialogue there.
On the part of the government as well, there is all the interest to have this free flow of communication, not only with the private sector, but also with civil society as a whole. You mentioned CNI, Confederação Nacional da Indústria. They have been doing a very good job of following up the negotiations. They have a number of publications that try to explain different aspects of OECD and what Brazil has to gain, etc., and so on. CNA, for the Confederation for Agriculture, has also recently asked to be an observer at Business at OECD, which is the organization that follows the OECD issues. CNI already is an observer at that organization. So there are channels to ensure that good communication will happen in that area. In relation to what are the most difficult areas, I mean, Brazilian legislation, that's what Andreas was referring to. Before asking for accession to OECD, we did an examination of the acquis. For each recommendation, we asked the pertinent ministries and agencies 2 questions. One more objective: is the Brazilian legislation in line with that recommendation? One more subjective: is the Brazilian policy in line, or should it be in line with that recommendation? So already in the first round of very quick examination, we had about 70% of the recommendations were considered okay, we already fulfill. Of course, one thing is we say that we fulfill, another thing is the members say we fulfill. There's a difference of appreciation there. I mean, already in the first goal, we had about 70%. Part of that was the result of some ministries did not understand very well the recommendation, or one ministry would say, there's no problem here, and another one would say, no way, I won't adhere to this recommendation. And then we had to see who didn't understand and who had the reason. And now we can say that about 90% of the recommendations we think we either fulfill or would be able to fulfill with minor changes in legislation that would be necessary, but that would be acceptable. Then there are those 10% where problems, more important problems are identified. Some of those still need more clarification, because I have the impression that in some cases the ministry that says that they have a problem, I have doubts if they fully understood the content. In some cases, the issue is that, okay, we agree that it would be good to go into that direction, but there is here legislation that is not in line, that would require some action in Congress, so it would take some time. And then in the end, there are, if you talk about the instruments, I think the main identified problem is really the transfer pricing, where we have a methodology to apply control transfer. For those who are not aware, transfer pricing is when you have a multinational company doing business with itself, with its own matrix and headquarters and the company installed in Brazil. So because they are the same company, they may practice a price which is not a real price. They can transfer the profit either for Brazil or for the headquarters to have a better tax situation. So the tax administration has to control what is the price in this transaction, and if they feel that the price is not the true price, they have to arbitrate the price to determine how taxes are going to apply. So the OECD has a methodology to do that. It's a more faithful methodology. It's closer to reality, but it's much more complex to apply. Brazil applies a methodology which is more simple, but of course makes the result not necessarily close to what is the reality of the transaction. So very technical, but a lot of work has been done there. We have a clear map of what is the situation, what has to be done. In the environmental area, the legislation in Brazil is very much in line with the recommendations, and the exercise that Júlia mentioned, the exercise which was done last year was done with the support of our ministry. It was financed by the UK. In that exercise, the Secretariat did exactly that. They took the main recommendations and they examined whether the Brazilian legislation was okay, but not only the legislation, the infra-legal instruments and the implementation of that legislation. And they found that in some areas it's okay, in other areas there's their way to go. So we have kind of a map of what we need to do to be in line with those recommendations. So I cannot say that from the perspectives of the OECD and the members it's 100% okay, but we have a clear view of what needs to be done and where it needs to be done. Now, this is talking about the instruments. Of course, for instance, if you take forests, there are no instruments on forests. You have a number of instruments on biodiversity, but we don't have many instruments that talk about, only indirectly talk about forests. But I'm sure, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm sure that this is going to be an issue in Brazilian accessions, because they don't examine only the instruments, but also the policies as a whole to see whether it's convergent with the policies of the OECD members. if you take an issue that Júlia mentioned, like assassination of rural leaders or environmental leaders, which is very regrettable and a problem that Brazil has to face, probably that's an issue that people will have an eye on and that Brazil have to make efforts to improve. And like that in other areas. So that was my point when I was saying, if you think that Brazilian policies are not aligned, so you should support very much the accession process, because then you would have to go through that process and improve Brazilian policies.
Very find an instrument for forests.
Okay, let's hear this question and then we take the question online.
Okay, first I have a question for Mr. Cozendey, então vou falar em português. Eu gostaria de saber, primeiramente, se relações comerciais, mas muito mais ideológicas, poderiam ser consideradas preocupantes, no sentido, com outros países, é claro, no sentido da adesão ao Brasil à OCDE, porque, assim, não conheço muito da história da adesão dos países à OCDE, mas acredito que esse possa ser quesito relevante.
I think this could be relevant if you compare with the history of those who joined the OCDE.
Qual a opinião da sociedade civil sobre a entrada do Brasil na OCDE enquanto organização, e você acredita que o Brasil deve ou não entrar na organização?
Okay, so there's any other question? Probably is last chance to ask questions, so go ahead.
Olá, muito obrigado a todos e pela discussão. I don't know if I should ask the question in English or in Portuguese, but it's mainly for Ambassador Cozendey, but also to, well, I think to everyone, if you have a take on this, it is mainly to say, to change a bit the perspective from Brazil to the own organization of OCDE in light of the current context of a climate emergency and the importance to take into account human rights and peace in the world, and especially in different communities. And it's mainly two questions. First, is Brazil, does Brazil agree to everything that the OCDE stands for and advises on? In light of this context, we think of how Brazil has to be in line with OCDE, but is it a point or another in which Brazil would rather not go the way of the OCDE, but rather go other ways and other types of way how to solve these problems? And the second question is, how do you think that the OCDE is open to modify consensus or improve practices and constantly reinvent itself? It could be in its own functioning or in how it exceeds countries from the south, like Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, or Brazil in the next few years. And how do you think that is possible? Thank you.
Okay, so we can probably allow for a last round of all of you to address these issues. Two questions were specific to Ambassador Cozendey, one for Júlia, and if Andreas wants to add any point.
So acho que esqueci a pergunta dele. Só lembra que eu vou lembrar.
Ok. Justamente para saber se a possibilidade ou as relações políticas.
Sim. Ok. Não, então, você não tem uma negociação comercial como tem na OMC, né? Os países todos da OCDE comerciam com todos os países do mundo.
Members of the OCDE they trade with every country in the world, members or not.
Não é nenhum impedimento a
does not prevent any trade.
Não existe uma discussão sobre com quem você pode fazer negócios ou com quem você não pode fazer negócios. O que existe uma discussão sobre quais as regras que presidem esse comércio, se elas são adequadas, não são adequadas. Então, claro, existem estudos na OCDE, por exemplo, sobre subsídios. Quais países dão subsídios? Isso altera a competição? Não altera? Existe uma preocupação grande, porque
twist competition, or
no caso da China, por exemplo, há muitas
thinking
empresas
about,
estatais que recebem
in China, for example,
apoio do governo. Então, há uma discussão sobre esse assunto, mas todos os países da OCDE fazem negócios com todos os países. Isso não,
but
não é
the OCDE members, they trade with all the countries in the world. About
para inglês agora. In terms of human rights, environment, how do you deal with that in the process of accession? Some of those issues, as I mentioned, are in instruments, and then you are, in principle, you have to adhere in the process to all the instruments. You cannot say, I don't like this instrument, I'm not going to go into it. But sometimes you can have an instrument that does not fully make sense. For instance, there is we always use this example, which is a recommendation for what architecture you should have in schools to avoid earthquakes. And then we say, well, we don't have earthquakes in Brazil, so I'm not going to make all my schools according to earthquake standards, right? But I will explain to the committee. I'll come to the committee and I'll explain to the committee, listen, Brazil doesn't have earthquakes. I won't spend money adapting my schools to earthquakes. And the committee will understand. If it makes sense, the committee will understand. We went through the process of accession to the codes of liberalization of capital movements, and we explained a lot of things. The committee asked us to do other things, so we did some modification. We did some that included a law. Again, not because they asked us, but because central bank thought it was good to do it, and it helped in the process of accession. So it's an interaction process that aims at improving our situation in the long run.
Julia, you want to answer the question that was addressed to you?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the word. So I can say that civil society is a big group, so there are many organizations in Brazil and globally discussing the accession process of Brazil, and some organizations are totally against it. And in our we don't have a position yet. I would say that the organizations that we just launched this research last week, what we've been doing is exactly what has been said today, is to actually understand what are the lacks of governance in Brazil, what are the problems we have now, and analyzing our history, because we did have some very strong instruments and institutions despite having problems in the past, but we are in a moment with very serious problems. And then in these studies, we show how to overcome these problems. So reforms that should be done if Brazil wants to accede to the OECD, whether we want it or not. But we can use this process to make sure that Brazil is going to be in the right track, in the sense of protecting environment, to protect people, to protect human rights, labor, workers. So I think it's Camila, right, who asked me this question. There are people who are against it, and there are people who are for it, and there are people who don't know yet, who want to actually discuss the process, to engage. And that's why we've been requesting OECD to make this process as open as possible, so that we can actually understand what is actually at stake, and that we can have a say in this process, we as civil society, right? So I invite you to read our papers and to read the reforms that we suggest in the fields that we are experts on. And we held for 2 years lots of consultations across civil society organizations and government, whoever wanted to participate. So thank you for this space, and I'm here very open to dialogue. Thank you.
Julia, invite me anytime you want.
Thank you. Let's talk.
Me too.
Andreas, you want to?
No, let me first take the question, and Portuguese, I only can say tudo bem, because this is as much as it takes me. But let me say I really enjoyed Julia, Carlos, Jose Antonio, Ana. It's a real great pleasure to have this occasion to discuss, and I want to leave this evening also with a call to all of you. Count on our openness to discuss the issue. I believe, you know, there was some talk about what is the risk of Brazil in the accession process. I think it's full of opportunity, actually, to discuss issues of policies. There are a number of instruments we have which can kind of help supporting a reform-oriented policy in a country. It's not necessarily that we have specific instruments which are only dedicated to human rights. We are not a human rights organization, but we have, for example, as I quoted in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, a strong human rights dimension. We had accession processes in the past, like the one on Colombia, where you had big issues around the treatment of trade unions, human rights there, which were addressed in a very open, transparent, and I have to say tough way in the accession process. And also some parts have not yet been solved, so there is a post-accession monitoring. But I think the OECD is or the OECD accession process can be a win-win for a country in order to reform itself. It can be win-win for business or association, for civil society to kind of discuss issues or to bring in conversations which are important. And it's certainly also in the interest of our members to discuss issues related to what can we achieve together in terms of global governance and shape globalization in a broader context. So count on us, continue to invite us, let's continue to get together. It's I have to say, I mean, I'm now in my 20th years of public service, and Brazil and the OECD is probably one of the most exciting projects I've ever been dealing with, and I'm personally very positive that we get there.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And, it has been indeed a very rich panel. Let me just close with three small points that I guess more or less close what we have been discussing. One of the issues that was mentioned at the beginning was that the OECD has democracies, and precisely the OECD has been insisting very much recently on this issue of the values. And this is important because democracies precisely give the floor, give options for civil society, for enterprises to voice their issues, and this is precisely what we want. No, at the end, Brazil will be joining a club of democracies, and that is very important from the outset. The second point, and just for you to keep this in mind, because a lot of people, it's true that they have questions. What is joining the OECD and youth? One that works very well with youth and with Latin Americans is the comparison with football, and that's always a good way. We Latin Americans always want sometimes that our best football players, and Brazil has many, well, play in some of the best teams in the world, and that happens. And what they get by playing also with some of the best players in the world is that they really improve their standards and really play much better. So right now the OECD has really selected Brazil as one of the good candidates to be in this team, and I'm sure that the accession process will be a very thorough and difficult process, but make sure that at the end of this process that player will be actually much better than it was at the beginning, and precisely on what it has been said. So let me just close. We will have a forum precisely in Brazil in June, which will be precisely to also communicate a bit more about what the OECD and Brazil have been doing together in all these years. So this is another opportunity also to engage more with Brazilians, because I understand that many have this interest. Let me thank well, the panelists, Ambassador Andreas, and obviously Júlia, that not only brought the gender balance a bit to this panel, but also this civil society perspective. And obviously, let me thank the organizers for inviting us to be here with us. Let me thank Anna, that has been an intern in my team for a good year almost, and it has been really good. And let me invite all of you to think of the OECD as a place where you can also obviously contribute.
Obrigado aos palestrantes, obrigado a todos que estão aqui. Em nome da equipe organizadora da Pour le Brésil, gostaria de agradecer a todas e todos por participarem do primeiro dia da conferência, e um agradecimento especial a todos os palestrantes e convidados que se juntaram a nós, e também a vocês, ouvintes, que nos acompanharam até aqui, seja presencialmente pela Sciences Po ou pelo Zoom. Amanhã teremos mais. O segundo dia da Conférence Pour le Brésil começará às 14 horas, aqui na Sciences Po e pelo Zoom. Começamos com o discurso de Guilherme Canella Godoy, da Unesco. Após, teremos um painel sobre democracia e, por fim, teremos o discurso de Françoise Verge e um painel sobre a cultura. Esperamos vê-los todos e todas amanhã, aqui na Sciences Po Paris ou no Zoom. Muito obrigado.
No.